On October 3, 1941, Adolf Hitler addressed the German people with another pompous speech. He declared that Germany's new offensive in the east would lead to the complete and final destruction of Russia. The day before, German troops had received orders to encircle Moscow. The Führer ordered that the future victory be immortalized in stone. From Germany to the outskirts of Moscow, shipments of red granite and white marble were sent. Parade uniforms were prepared for the triumphant march of the Wehrmacht across Red Square. But the Germans never managed to take Moscow. The Soviet command implemented completely unprecedented measures of resistance. Indeed, such resistance as on the Moscow front had rarely been seen anywhere before. The Battle of Moscow lasted 203 days. Combat operations were conducted along a front stretching over 800 kilometers. Since the beginning of World War II, the European continent had never witnessed battles of such scale. This became the first serious defeat of Germany since its victorious advance in 1939. What fate had Hitler prepared for the Soviet capital? How did Moscow's citizens survive the days of siege? And why did the German forces fail to march across Red Square? On October 15, 1941, Moscow was gripped by panic. Trucks loaded to the top with factory machinery, furniture, paintings, and sculptures from the capital's museums rushed toward Kazansky railway station. Everything was urgently loaded onto special evacuation trains. That same day, the State Defense Committee adopted a secret resolution on the evacuation of Moscow. The day before, German troops had broken through the last line of the city's defenses. There were almost no forces left to protect the capital. Every hour mattered. Government institutions and foreign embassies received orders to immediately evacuate to Kuibyshev. The next day, October 16th, the Moscow metro did not open, the first and only time in its history. By order of Kaganovich, metro stations were to be mined and prepared for demolition. Most Moscow factories were shut down, and workers were paid double wages. Rumors spread that German troops had already been seen inside the city. Crowds of people flooded onto Gorky Highway and other roads leading east. Some party officials hastily destroyed their party membership cards. Soviet writer Lev Lasky later recalled, rank-and-file party members ran along sidewalks, roadsides, and tram tracks, dragging suitcases, bundles, and bags. In the Potok of refugees, everything was mixed together: people, cars, carts, tractors, cows. At 3 o'clock, a traffic jam formed on a bridge. Instead of pushing the stuck trucks off the bridge, everyone rushed first to seize seats inside them. A real fight broke out. Those sitting in the trucks desperately fought off attackers. They beat them with suitcases pram po golovam, straight over the head. The panic that began in Moscow was, in essence, the result of actions taken by the city's party authorities. People did not understand what was happening. They received information that the government had left, that food was being distributed, that money was being paid out. This meant, in their minds, that Moscow was about to be abandoned. At the same time, middle management began leaving the city in large numbers by car. Factory directors, officials, people who owned vehicles and had accumulated stolen goods. Workers began intercepting them. They shouted that they were traitors, that they were going to hand Moscow over to the fascists, and they began beating them. Soviet correspondent Vasily Grossman wrote, "Directors of many enterprises loaded their families onto trucks and evacuated from the capital. That was when it all began. The population rushed to loot stores, the streets filled with drunken civilians carrying rings of sausage and rolls of fabric under their arms. Things began happening that would have been unthinkable just 2 days earlier. Rumors spread that Stalin and the government had fled Moscow. According to the evacuation plan, Joseph Stalin was indeed supposed to leave Moscow on October 16th. Lavrenti Beria had already ordered a special train to be prepared for the commander-in-chief. For a time, it was unclear whether Moscow would be abandoned. The German advance in September to October was extremely threatening. In Kuibyshev, several dachas were prepared for Stalin. Offices were equipped for him. But Stalin made the decision to remain in Moscow. His train stood ready at Abelmanovskaya Zastava, but Stalin never came to it. He did not simply defend Moscow. He remained in the city, continuing to lead not only the defense of Moscow, but the entire front of the country. This decision marked a turning point. On October 17th, Stalin demanded immediate order be restored in the city. On that same day, the first secretary of the Moscow City Committee, Alexander Shcherbakov, spoke on the radio and declared that Moscow would not be surrendered. On October 20th, a state of siege was declared in the capital, and a curfew was imposed. Police and NKVD troops appeared on the roads. They were given orders to execute on the spot all provocateurs, deserters, and looters. Factories reopened. The metro resumed operations. On November 6, 1941, on the eve of the anniversary of the October Revolution, Stalin addressed the party activists of Moscow at the Mayakovskaya metro station. On that same day, 250 German bombers carried out an air raid on the city. The enemy had captured most of Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and a number of other regions. They had seized the Donbass, loomed like a dark cloud over Leningrad, and now threatened the glorious capital, Moscow. Our task, he declared, would be to eliminate every German who had entered the territory of our republic as an occupier. No mercy for the German occupiers. The Soviet command took completely unprecedented measures to resist the German advance. Indeed, such resistance as on the Moscow front was rarely seen anywhere. In the Battle of Moscow, German forces suffered their first major defeat since the beginning of World War II. The Wehrmacht lost around 500,000 soldiers killed and wounded. This was twice as many losses as Germany had suffered in the French and Polish campaigns combined. The myth of the invincibility of the Third Reich was shattered. The Blitzkrieg plan in the East had failed. Soviet counterattacks near Moscow destroyed all of Hitler's plans for a quick and easy victory over the Soviet Union. The battle for Moscow became the first truly strategic confrontation in which the Germans encountered a deeply organized and extremely difficult defense. As is now known, already in the autumn of 1941, when it became clear that Moscow could not be taken, many of Hitler's close associates raised the question of urgently signing a peace treaty with the Soviets, because it was evident that the war would end badly for Germany. Hitler was the main architect of the plan for a lightning war against the USSR. He never doubted the success of his Blitzkrieg, despite objections from some German generals. The plan called for the complete destruction of the Red Army and the rapid capture of the largest cities and industrial centers of the USSR, including Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow. By the autumn of 1941, these objectives had been partially achieved. In September, Army Group Center captured Smolensk, advancing 500 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. At one of the military meetings in July 1941, Hitler stated, "I constantly try to put myself in the position of the enemy. In practice, he has already lost the war. It is good that we destroyed the Russian tank and air forces at the very beginning. The Russians will never be able to restore them." The core of Operation Barbarossa, as Hitler insisted, was the destruction of the Red Army. The goal was to encircle the Red Army in border battles, annihilate its professional corps units, and then advance deep into Soviet territory, sweeping aside whatever minor forces Stalin could still bring forward. The central direction of the offensive was important, but the initial objective was not a direct breakthrough to Moscow, but the creation of massive encirclements along the border. And that is exactly what was done. It was believed that within 10 to 12 weeks, roughly 3 months, the main strategic objectives would be achieved, the key points of Soviet territory would be captured, and the Soviet Union would be defeated and forced to request capitulation. In 1941, more than 4.5 million people lived in Moscow. It was the largest industrial, scientific, and cultural center of the country. Hitler planned to erase the Russian capital from the face of the earth by flooding it with water from reservoirs outside the city. The strategic logic was clear. Moscow was the largest industrial and transportation hub in the country. Controlling it meant controlling vast territories and gaining a decisive strategic position. In principle, the capture of Moscow was planned as one of the main objectives. It was one of the primary missions of Army Group Center, the most important German force grouping. But Hitler made a strategic decision that effectively slowed the advance on Moscow. He withdrew tank forces from Army Group Center and redirected them north toward Leningrad and south toward Ukraine. In September 1941, German forces captured Kiev and blockaded Leningrad. After that, Hitler ordered all major forces to be thrown against Moscow. The operation was named Typhoon. Its architect was the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Bock was a highly professional military commander, a pure Prussian, a veteran of the First World War, and a former general staff officer. He was short, thin, and austere in appearance. His plan was simple and precise. He proposed delivering 3 main strikes. 2 tank groups would strike on the flanks, while the 4th Field Army would advance in the center. First, the tank groups would create massive encirclement pockets, destroying the forces defending the Moscow direction. Then, after sealing these pockets, the tank groups would hand them over to the infantry, which would compress and eliminate the surrounded Soviet units. After that, the tank groups would break through around Moscow from the north and south, encircle the city, cut it off completely, and at that point, the infantry armies, after finishing the destruction of the defending forces, would advance on Moscow itself. Moscow, in this plan, would be left defenseless. The plan was simple, but extremely effective. A traditional German operational concept. Powerful, rapid armored thrusts would split the Soviet defenses, partially encircle and destroy them, then close the ring, subject Moscow to airstrikes, and force it either to surrender or to be taken by assault. For this purpose, special tank groups were formed. The Germans favored creating such operational tactical formations, heavily saturated with armored vehicles. From the west, Moscow was defended by three Soviet fronts: the Bryansk Front under General Yeremenko, the Reserve Front under Marshal Budyonny, and the Western Front under General Konev. The Soviet command expected the Germans to advance on Moscow via the Smolensk Highway, but this assumption proved wrong. Operation Typhoon began early in the morning of September 30th, 1941. German tank armies under the command of Guderian and Hübner struck in the south, near Bryansk, where they were least expected. Avoiding frontal assaults, the Germans broke into the rear of Soviet forces, and within 3 days completely encircled the main forces of the Bryansk front. The front commander, Andrei Yeremenko, was seriously wounded and evacuated to Moscow. Here, the Germans used their famous, well-developed tactical doctrine, simple but highly effective for that time. Tank wedges split the defending armies, penetrated deep into the rear, followed by strikes from combat aviation, and then infantry forces moved in. This was a method first tested in France and later perfected on the Eastern Front. These steel fists were one of the key innovations of the German army. But most importantly, these armored wedges crushed rear areas, destroyed communications, disorganized logistics, and destabilized Soviet command structures. Then the infantry followed, sealing the encirclements and destroying the surrounded forces. Using the breach that had been created, German tanks rushed toward Tula. Colonel Mikhail Katukov was ordered to block their path. His brigade had 61 tanks, including 22 of the new T-34s. Near Mitsensk, Katukov decided to set up an ambush. Allowing Guderian's forward units to pass through, Soviet tank crews suddenly struck the Germans from the flanks and rear. At point-blank range, the T-34s easily penetrated the armor of enemy tanks. According to official data, Katukov's brigade destroyed 133 German vehicles in just a few days of fighting. Heinz Guderian, regarded as a genius of armored blitzkrieg warfare, was stunned by what had happened. He immediately sent a report to Berlin demanding changes in German tank design, and even summoned the famous German engineer Ferdinand Porsche to Oriol so that he could personally study the construction of the Soviet T-34. Later, Guderian recalled, "The 4th Panzer Division was stopped by Russian tanks. It went through an extremely difficult moment. For the first time, the clear superiority of the Russian T-34 tanks became evident. The division suffered heavy losses. The planned rapid advance on Tula had to be postponed." It should be noted that German tanks at that time were not yet what they would become later in the war. There were no Panthers, no Tigers, and not even fully upgraded Panzer IVs. Nevertheless, there were many tanks, they were fast, and thanks to their high mobility, they often achieved success. On October 2nd, 1941, German forces launched an offensive in the central sector of the front. They attacked Soviet positions from the flanks on both sides of the Smolensk Highway. German armored wedges broke through the defenses and rushed toward each other. 2 days later, the ring closed near Vyazma. 5 Soviet armies were trapped in the encirclement. In total, near Bryansk and Vyazma, the Germans surrounded 2/3 of all Soviet forces on the western direction. Command and control in many units collapsed completely. Mixed with waves of civilian refugees, surviving soldiers retreated eastward in chaos. Correspondent Vasily Grossman wrote, "I thought I had seen retreat before, but something like this I had never seen. I could not even have imagined it. Exodus, biblical." Vehicles moved in 8 rows, the howling roar of dozens of trucks simultaneously tearing themselves out of the mud. Crowds of pedestrians with sacks, bundles, and suitcases. After crushing 3 Soviet fronts, German forces rushed toward Kalinin, today's Tver. On October 14th, the city was taken. The encirclement of the Soviet capital seemed only a matter of time to the Germans. The front was collapsing. Our armies were falling into colossal encirclements. Commanders were dying, corps were disappearing, entire formations were vanishing. The army was simply falling apart. When Rokossovsky arrived at the front, appointed as an army commander, he had nothing under his command. He was told, "You will arrive and receive your command. Here is a rifle division. Here is another rifle division. Perhaps a cavalry corps will arrive." And so he traveled. One place had a division, another did not. Somewhere a cadet brigade would be assigned. Somewhere something else. And so Rokossovsky received an unknown mixture of forces. And from that, he began to forge an army. 45-year-old Lieutenant General Konstantin Rokossovsky had extensive combat experience. Polish by origin, he served in a dragoon regiment during the First World War and was awarded the Cross of St. George. During the Civil War, he fought against the White forces in Siberia and was wounded in hand-to-hand combat. During Stalin's purges, Rokossovsky was arrested on false charges and spent nearly 3 years in NKVD prisons. He was released in 1940. And already in October 1941, Rokossovsky received the order to stop the German advance on Moscow at any cost. Gathering the remnants of surviving armies, he organized several defensive strong points along the Leningrad and Volokholamsk highways. By his order, the gates of the Istra Reservoir were blown up. These measures slowed the German advance. After receiving news of the defeat of 3 Soviet fronts, Stalin urgently summoned another veteran of the First World War from Leningrad, General Georgy Zhukov. Upon arriving at the front, Zhukov was unable to locate most army headquarters. He set out alone in a car to search for commanders. After driving through the front-line zone, Zhukov reported to Stalin, "Virtually all roads to Moscow are open. The last line on the way to the city is the Mozhaisk defensive line, still under construction, 120 kilometers from the capital." In the construction of these fortifications, special emphasis was placed on anti-tank defenses. Civilians were mobilized to dig anti-tank trenches and build fortifications designed primarily to stop tanks, not just infantry. To defend the Mozhaisk line, Zhukov sent all combat-ready units he could find in Moscow. Among them were cadets from 6 Moscow military schools. Cadets were thrown into battle, including the Podolsk cadets. It showed the desperate situation of the Soviet command. They were forced to send officer-cadet battalions to the front, because sending fully trained Podolsk cadets into combat meant sacrificing future officers who could have staffed several armies, and there were only 2 battalions. On October 5th, cadets from 2 Podolsk schools were ordered to occupy defensive positions near the village of Ilinskoye. Most of them were barely 18 years old. A German column stretching several kilometers advanced toward them along the Warsaw Highway. Armed with rifles and machine guns, with almost no logistical support, the cadets held back the enemy for nearly 2 weeks. They destroyed German infantry breaking toward the trenches in hand-to-hand combat. German tanks were fired upon with the few light guns they had. Cadet Ivan Makuka later recalled, Direct hits on the bunker knocked us off our feet with the blast wave, showered us with concrete fragments, and blood poured from our eyes and ears. I suffered a concussion and received 7 grenade fragments. It was not only Podolsk cadets who fought there. Cadets from other military schools were there as well. But it was precisely the battle of the Podolsk cadets, who lost nearly half of their personnel, that became an extremely important moral and psychological symbol of resilience for Soviet troops. Zhukov managed to gain time to prepare the capital for a prolonged siege. Trenches and barricades made of felled trees appeared on the approaches to Moscow. Highways, bridges, and railroads were mined. Anti-tank hedgehogs were installed in the streets, and massive barricades were built. Luftwaffe aircraft bombed the Soviet capital almost daily. In November 1941 alone, they carried out 45 air raids on Moscow. 400 residential buildings were destroyed in the city. One bomb struck the Bolshoi Theater, another pierced the roof of the Grand Kremlin Palace. British correspondent Alexander Wirth, who was in the Soviet capital at the time, recalled, "Shrapnel from anti-aircraft shells drummed on the streets like hail. Dozens of searchlights illuminated the sky. In London, I had never seen or heard anything like it. To confuse German pilots, fake airfields, factories, and other structures were built around Moscow. During night raids, residents were forbidden to turn on lights. At times, more than 1,000 anti-aircraft guns fired simultaneously at the enemy." Luftwaffe Oberleutnant Bether wrote, "Of all the missions I flew in the East, the night flights over Moscow were the most difficult. Anti-aircraft fire was extremely intense and frighteningly accurate. Photographs of Moscow in 1941 show anti-aircraft guns everywhere. On Borodinsky Bridge, on Gorky Street, across the city. A massive number of barrage balloons were launched into the air. A barrage balloon is a large balloon suspended by a long steel cable. Bombing Moscow during the day meant almost certain destruction. Air raids were therefore conducted mainly at night. When aircraft flew low, beneath the level of the balloons, they often caught their wings on the cables. A plane that struck one of these cables rarely survived. As German aircraft were lost, the number of air raids sharply decreased." In mid-October, torrential rains poured over Moscow. Vasily Grossman wrote, "No one had ever seen mud like this. Rain, snow, sleet. A bottomless swamp, black dough kneaded by tens of thousands of boots, wheels, and tracks. The movement of German columns slowed dramatically. Supplying the army operationally became impossible. Our roads in these directions turned into rivers of mud. Tanks could pass, slowly, but they passed. Tracked vehicles could move through, but most of the equipment was not tracked. Vehicles sank into the mire and became stuck. They had to be pulled out, and the tempo of movement sharply declined. Supply systems collapsed completely. Soldiers remained in trenches under constant rain. Everything was wet. When everything is wet, food rots, but it is eaten anyway because there is nothing else. An epidemic of severe stomach illnesses began. It was not fatal. There were fatal diseases, but this was not one of them. But a man suffering from extreme gastrointestinal illness is not a soldier. He is an exhausted human being, incapable of fighting. German generals waited for General Frost to arrive and freeze everything solid. This is visible in the notes of von Bock, who wrote, "We are waiting. They promise that Frost will strike any day now, and we will go on the offensive." On November 7th, 1941, a parade was held in Moscow to mark the 14th anniversary of the October Revolution. It was the only military parade on Red Square during the entire Great Patriotic War. The next would take place only in June 1945. Until the very last moment, the parade was kept in the strictest secrecy. Participants prepared not for a parade, but for immediate departure to the front. A battalion of heavy KV tanks arrived on the square directly from the factory. At 8 in the morning, Joseph Stalin ascended the tribune of Lenin's mausoleum. Addressing the soldiers and officers, he said, "The enemy is not as strong as some frightened intellectuals portray him. The devil is not as terrible as he is painted. Who can deny that our Red Army has more than once turned the vaunted German troops into retreat? Comrades of the Red Army and Red Navy, commanders, political officers, partisans and partisans, the whole world looks to you as a force capable of destroying the predatory, arrogant German invaders. All the peoples of Europe, temporarily under the yoke of German tyranny, look to you as their liberators. A great mission of liberation has fallen upon your share. Be worthy of this mission." The parade of November 7th, 1941 on Red Square had enormous psychological and moral political significance. Many who marched across the square went directly to the front, and many would never return. But above all, it was a demonstration of resolve. We would not retreat, and we would fight to the end. In mid-November, the first severe frosts struck. As soon as the roads froze, orders were issued to the German forces to resume the offensive. One of the directives stated, "To all commanders of the 4th Panzer Group, the period of uncertainty is over. We can advance again. We must destroy the final defensive line of Moscow. We must stop the beating heart of the Bolshevik Empire and complete our campaign this year." The frozen ground shook under the thunder of thousands of guns and mortars. The main German strike was delivered along the Leningrad highway. On November 23rd, they captured Klin. The next day, they entered Solnechnogorsk and were stopped only near the Kryukovo station. In the north, the settlement of Krasnaya Polyana was taken. From there, less than 30 kilometers remained to the center of Moscow. Through their field binoculars, German officers could already see the suburbs of the city. But the Germans never managed to break into Moscow. Their path was blocked by Rokossovsky's 16th Army. On December 4th, German forces were forced to shift to defense. On the same day, intense morosi struck. Icy winds piled massive snowdrifts. German Private Heise wrote home, "I cannot even describe what this means. First, it is terribly cold. Blizzards. My feet are soaked through. My boots never dry, and we are forbidden to take them off. And second, the Russians are pressing forward." The morale of the German troops was already weak. The soldiers had endured the autumn and early winter, disease, and extremely harsh conditions at the front. In addition, the German General Staff completely failed in the delivery of winter clothing. Trainloads of supplies existed, but the trains were stuck. Not only were the trains delayed, but several convoys carrying artillery lubricants were also lost. German artillery could operate in cold conditions, but only if proper lubricants were available. The lubricants used in summer became viscous in freezing temperatures, and mechanical parts stopped moving. As a result, the offensive collapsed, and within just 2 weeks, it failed completely. In early December 1941, temperatures fell below -30 degrees Celsius. In the mornings, German soldiers lit fires under their tanks and aircraft. But frozen engines would not start. Weapons failed. Communication systems stopped working. Bread arrived frozen solid and had to be chopped or sawn apart. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags and seized all warm clothing from peasants. In some Wehrmacht units, the number of frostbite cases exceeded the number of combat casualties. In Germany, a special medal was later created for the winter campaign near Moscow. Within the army, it received a grim, unofficial nickname, frozen flesh. And this term perhaps best described the condition in which the German troops found themselves. In reality, the myth of General Frost, once invented by Napoleon to explain his own defeat, was fully adopted by the Germans. General Frost became a convenient excuse. After all, one cannot admit that the enemy was stronger, because then the question arises, why did you attack in the first place? The real problem was not the weather. It was a complete underestimation of the enemy's strength and a fundamentally incorrect assessment of the Soviet leadership's ability to mobilize and bring forward reserves. By the time the decisive strike on Moscow was to be delivered, German forces were already exhausted, and exhausted troops cannot be thrown into decisive battle. In November 1941, Zhukov developed the plan for a counteroffensive near Moscow. It envisioned the elimination of 2 German salients to the north and south of the city. In the rear areas, 11 new armies were formed. Among them were the famous Siberian divisions, which underwent special training. Soldiers were equipped with skis, sheepskin coats, and white camouflage suits. New T-34 tanks were painted white and fitted with wide tracks to improve mobility in snow. A critically important factor was the situation in the Far East. A massive Japanese Kwantung Army force, more than 1 million troops, stood there. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union was forced to maintain a huge defensive contingent in that region. But when it became clear, thanks in part to Soviet intelligence, including Richard Sorge, that Japan had decided not to attack the Soviet Union until at least the spring of 1942, this made it possible to transfer several divisions from the Far East. These divisions did not play a single decisive role on their own, but they were extremely important because, while still in transit by rail, they were sent directly to the most dangerous sectors, including the northwestern direction near Dubosekovo, Klin, and that entire axis of advance. On December 5, 1941, Soviet forces went on the offensive. The next day, fierce battles erupted along the entire front line. Zhukov ordered Soviet units to bypass enemy strongpoints and push as rapidly as possible into the German rear. Now, it was the German armies near Moscow that faced the threat of complete encirclement. On December 8th, the Wehrmacht received Hitler's order to shift to defensive positions along the entire Soviet-German front. But the Germans could no longer stop the Red Army. Wehrmacht Private Foltgeimer wrote to his wife, "This is hell. The Russians do not want to leave Moscow. They have begun their offensive. Every hour brings terrible news for us. I beg you, stop writing to me about silk and rubber boots that I promised to bring you from Moscow. Understand this. I am dying. I will die. I feel it." In mid-December, Soviet forces liberated Solnechnogorsk, Klin, Volokolamsk, Istra, Kalinin, Stalinogorsk, and Kaluga. For his role in the Battle of Moscow, General Rokossovsky was awarded the Order of Lenin. The troops of General Rokossovsky, pursuing the 5th, 10th, and 11th Panzer Divisions, the SS Division, and the 35th Infantry Division of the enemy, captured the city of Istra. For a renewed offensive on Moscow, the Germans concentrated extremely large forces. The main strike against Moscow was delivered by large mechanized and motorized formations. This second German offensive failed completely. As a result of 3 weeks of intense fighting, during which Red Army units defended every inch of Soviet soil and inflicted massive losses on the enemy, German forces were finally exhausted. Red Army units launched a decisive counterattack and went over to the offensive. The remnants of German forces were crushed. The Germans were now in full retreat. All of this was achieved through the extraordinary heroism of Soviet soldiers, commanders, and political officers who, fighting for Soviet land, knew that Moscow stood behind them. The enemy fled in disgrace. We successfully pursued the enemy, destroying his forces and capturing his equipment. The counteroffensive near Moscow was delivered, first, at the right moment, and second, in the right place. And it produced an exceptionally powerful effect. German generals fell into panic. They were accustomed to fighting with numerical and tactical superiority, but now they were seized by fear. German generals began insisting on the urgent withdrawal of German forces to positions much farther from Moscow, in effect, calling for a rollback of the entire Soviet-German front. To preserve the Eastern Front, the German High Command was forced to urgently redeploy divisions from Western Europe to Moscow. Wehrmacht General Günther Blumentritt wrote, "This was the turning point of our Eastern campaign. Our hopes of forcing Russia out of the war collapsed at the very last moment." Germany's political leadership now had to understand that the days of blitzkrieg were over. They were facing an army that, in its combat qualities, far surpassed any other army they had ever encountered on the battlefield. This was the first truly serious defeat of Germany since its victorious advance began in 1939, a defeat involving hundreds of thousands of casualties. It had enormous political significance. In 1941, a British delegation led by Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden arrived in Moscow on the personal instruction of Prime Minister Winston Churchill and held negotiations with the Soviet Union. These talks were extremely important for the formation of the future Allied coalition. It was already becoming clear that not immediately, not suddenly, but inevitably, the Battle of Moscow meant that the final outcome of the war would be Germany's defeat and the victory of the Allies. In February 1942, the documentary film The Defeat of the German Forces Near Moscow by directors Leonid Varlamov and Ilya Kopylin was released in Soviet cinemas. Soon after, in the United States, the film received the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Thus, the work of Varlamov and Kopylin became the first Soviet film to receive the highest honor of the American Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Honoring the heroic struggle of the Soviet people against Nazism, Winston Churchill said, "When the war is won, and I am confident it will be, we expect that Soviet Russia, Great Britain, and the United States will meet at the conference table of victory as the three principal participants and as those whose actions will have destroyed Nazism."